Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. The U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz has taken effect as President Donald Trump claimed that Iran wants to make a peace deal very badly. Meanwhile, the Iranian president said that unreasonable demands from the U.S. blocked agreement during peace talks in Islamabad. In Europe, NATO allies have refused to join Washington's plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, saying they would not be drawn into the conflict. Instead, Britain and France are planning to co-host a summit this week, aimed at restoring the freedom of navigation in the waterway. North Korea said it test-fired strategic cruise missiles and anti-warship missiles from its naval destroyer. Its state media released photos of leader Kim Jong-un observing the launches, where he reportedly said recent developments have boosted the regime's military readiness for strategic action. U.S. President Donald Trump has confirmed a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, warning Iran against any military approach. Meanwhile, the Iranian president says the U.S. was the reason weekend talks failed, and that the blockade will have global repercussions. Our Kim Bo-young tells us more.
The U.S. officially said that it began blocking ships from entering or exiting Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz at 10 a.m. Monday U.S. Eastern Time. Speaking to reporters at the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed the blockade and claimed that Iran wants to make a peace deal very badly, adding that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon.
Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal.
According to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. military deployed more than 15 naval vessels to the region for the operation. Writing on Truth Social, Trump said the U.S. military had obliterated 158 Iranian ships and that any Iranian fast attack ships that go near a U.S. maritime blockade zone would be eliminated. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said that unreasonable demands from the U.S. blocked agreement during talks at the weekend. In a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday, he said Tehran had clearly outlined the conditions for the ceasefire and remained committed to them. He further claimed that Iran will continue negotiations only within the framework of international law. Regarding Washington's blockade of Iranian ports along the Strait of Hormuz, Pezeshkian warned that actions that threaten the strait will have widespread global repercussions. Kim Bo-young, Arirang News.
Over in Europe, NATO allies are refusing to back U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, deepening divisions within the alliance after failed talks with Iran. Britain and France say they will instead pursue diplomatic efforts to restore navigation, as the United Nations calls for continued dialogue and respect for international law. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
NATO allies are refusing to join U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, signaling they will only intervene after active fighting ends, a move that could deepen tensions within the alliance. The announcement comes after weekend talks failed to resolve the 6-week conflict with Iran. Trump said the U.S. military would work with partners to block all maritime traffic through the critical waterway, which handles roughly a fifth of global oil supplies. However, key NATO members, including Britain and France, pushed back, saying they would not participate in the blockade. Instead, they are preparing a separate initiative to reopen the strait and ensure safe navigation once hostilities subside. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK and France will co-host talks this week aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the strait.
And, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that together with President Macron, I will convene a summit of leaders this week to drive forward the international effort we have built in recent weeks, bringing together dozens of countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
He stressed that the talks will focus mainly on diplomatic efforts to bring pressure to bear for a negotiated end to the conflict and for the strait to be opened, and military planning to provide assurance to shipping as soon as a stable environment can be established. French President Emmanuel Macron also announced plans for a multinational mission to coordinate naval escorts and establish rules for safe passage through the waterway. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a continued dialogue between the United States and Iran following talks in Islamabad that ended without agreement. UN spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric said on Monday that the recent discussions were a positive step toward renewed diplomacy, despite ongoing differences.
Given the deeply rooted differences, an agreement cannot be reached overnight, and the Secretary General calls on the talks to continue constructively in order for an agreement to be reached.
He also urged all sides to respect ceasefire efforts and uphold international law, including the principle of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, over the weekend, North Korea test-fired strategic cruise missiles and anti-warship missiles from its 5,000-ton class destroyer, Choe Hyon. The North Korean Central News Agency this morning released photos of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un observing the missile launches, where he reportedly said that recent achievements in defense science have qualitatively boosted the regime's military readiness for strategic action. He further called for steady and unlimited development of a powerful and reliable nuclear war deterrent. Kim had previously observed strategic cruise missile tests from the Choe Hyon on March 4th and 10th. And now for more on what's behind North Korea's recent series of missile launches, we're joined today by Professor Brian Myers, North Korea analyst at Dongsa University. Professor Myers, thanks for coming on today.
It's good to be with you.
So North Korea said this morning that it tested cruise and anti-warship missiles from a naval destroyer, after it conducted a series of weapons tests. And some say this suggests the regime is seeking to sort of draw lessons from the war in the Middle East to strengthen its military deterrence against the U.S. and South Korea. What do you make of the missile launches, and how might North Korea be viewing this Iran war?
Well, North Korea is a military-first state by its own definition. So the constant production and testing of weapons and refining their reliability is really the central activity of the whole state. It's business as usual. But these latest tests do look like a reaction to the asymmetric war that has been unfolding in the Middle East. And by that, I mean, you've got a pretty small and poor country defending itself against a superpower by using low-cost weapons to knock out very expensive American and Israeli assets. So I think Kim Jong-un has been learning from Iran's successes, like its use of cluster bombs, for example, but also from Iran's failures, like the many losses which Iran has taken to its missile and drone launchers. Now, the reason that these latest tests center on North Korea's ships and its anti-ship missiles is because the war in the Middle East has shown just how important it is to defend coastlines, to prevent naval blockades, and so on. Like Iran, North Korea does not have much of a navy. It basically has a coast guard that calls itself a navy. So it needs missiles that can be fired from ships out into the deep blue ocean. So all of this makes good sense from a military standpoint. And knowing the North Koreans, they're probably going to be making very quick progress.
Right, and Kim Jong-un met China's foreign minister over the weekend in Pyongyang. What does this say about relations between North Korea and China?
Well, the relationship was probably pretty good to begin with. Our media in Western countries tend to play up any signs of tension between Beijing and Pyongyang. But I think there's an element of wishful thinking involved. We want our adversaries to argue with each other, when in fact, these two countries are well aware how much they need each other, with the need greater in North Korea's case, of course. China is its biggest trade partner by far. Russia doesn't come close. But there's no denying that the relationship between Russia and North Korea, between Putin and Kim Jong-un, has become a warmer one because they're fighting a war with each other, and that really brings countries together. So the relationship with China has been less of a priority to Kim Jong-un, and he didn't really mind showing that. At the last Party Congress in Pyongyang, China was not mentioned very often. But now he is saying that relations with Beijing are a top priority, and Wang Yi has responded in a similar vein. So I think we're seeing an effort now to renew the friendship because that war in the Middle East is making all of these so-called authoritarian states realize that they need to stand closer together.
Right, and Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are scheduled to meet in Beijing next month. How might North Korea issues be brought up in these talks?
Well, I don't think North Korea is going to be all that high on the agenda because the two leaders are going to have a lot of other big problems to talk about, most of them connected in some way to the war in the Middle East and all those supply disruptions that it has caused. Taiwan is another big issue, of course, maybe bigger now than ever. Also, it's a bad time for America to start complaining about North Korea's nuclear program because the whole world is now saying, whether we like Kim Jong-un or not, we've got to admit he was smart to stick to that nuclear weapons program. So Trump, I think, will not be complaining very loudly that China is not enforcing sanctions on North Korea firmly enough. I expect that President Trump is going to use this occasion to ask about North Korea. He's going to find out, has Kim Jong-un been saying anything to the Chinese about a willingness to negotiate with America? And I expect that President Xi will stick to China's traditional position in regard to Kim's nuclear program, which is that North Korea and the United States should work together to diffuse tensions in the region.
I see. And Professor Myers, before I let you go, South Korea's spy agency recently said North Korea appears to be distancing itself from Iran in an effort to keep room for diplomacy open with Washington. What's your take on this?
I get the same impression. Of course, Kim Jong-un has never been as overt or aggressive about supplying Israel's enemies in the Middle East as his father and his grandfather were. His father was a pretty major proliferator, selling weapons to Iran and Yemen. But even quite recently, Kim Jong-un was directly or indirectly supplying Hamas and Hezbollah with rocket-propelled grenades and other stuff. And Iran may well have purchased those weapons from North Korea and passed them on. So if you keep that history in mind, you would expect North Korea to be helping Iran now, but apparently it isn't. So I think this is indeed an indication that Kim Jong-un wants to keep his options open for talks with the United States. America has been weakened by this war. President Trump is unpopular. He needs a diplomatic victory of some sort. So Kim Jong-un may be thinking this could be the perfect time to talk to the Americans and maybe work out a really good deal.
Right. All right, Professor Myers, thanks so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
U.S. President Donald Trump has nominated former Korean-American Congresswoman Michelle Park Steele as the next U.S. ambassador to South Korea. According to a presidential nomination document released Monday, Steele, a former two-term Republican lawmaker from California, is tapped to take on the role as Seoul and Washington navigate key issues. The ambassador post in Seoul has remained vacant since Philip Goldberg departed in January last year. Steele previously served on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during Trump's first term. She was elected to the House in 2020, re-elected in 2022, but lost her seat in last year's general election. President Lee Jae-myung hosted Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk at the Blue House on Monday for their first summit talks, which led the two countries to upgrade their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yoo-jin reports.
Wearing a tie in the colors of Poland's national flag, President Lee Jae-myung welcomed Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk to the Blue House on Monday for their first summit. Lee and Tusk agreed to upgrade South Korea and Poland's strategic partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership. As expected, defense ties were at the center of the talks.
양국의 고해적 방산 협력은 더욱 확대될 것입니다. 저는 양국 간의 방산 협력이 심화 발전할 수 있도록 이미 체결한 총괄 계약의 안정적 이행이 필요하다고 말씀드렸습니다.
Defense cooperation remains the key driving force of our bilateral relations. We will continue with this cooperation while also accelerating technology transfer, localization, and the relocation of production facilities to Poland.
The remarks refer to a defense framework agreement worth more than $44 billion signed in 2022, South Korea's largest overseas arms deal to date. Since then, Korean defense firms have signed follow-up contracts to supply equipment such as K-2 tanks and K-9 self-propelled howitzers. Beyond defense, the two sides are set to expand cooperation in energy, infrastructure, and high-tech industries. President Lee particularly called for Poland's support in helping Korean battery firms enter the country's energy storage system market. Prime Minister Tusk, noting that South Korea is Asia's largest investor in Poland, said he would continue efforts to ensure a favorable business environment. Also discussed was coping with the fallout from the war in the Middle East.
또한 양국 모두 중동 전쟁이 불러온 위기에 대처하기 위해 글로벌 공급망의 안정화가 중요하다는 점에 공감하였고, 이를 위해 필요한 협력을 이어나가기로 뜻을 모았습니다.
We must work together toward a new geopolitical balance and peace, and I believe Poland and the Republic of Korea should join forces in this effort.
The summit wrapped up with an official lunch featuring a blend of Korean and Polish cuisine. The Polish Prime Minister's visit comes less than 2 weeks after President Lee hosted the leaders of France and Indonesia at the Blue House. The visit marks another in a series of recent summits as global uncertainties persist. 송유진, Arirang News.
BTS Arirang World Tour has sparked much speculation about the potential economic gains of the group's performances, given its remarkable global fan base. Our Park Jun-an has this report.
To create unforgettable moments, global BTS fans army visited South Korea to enjoy the opening week of the group's world tour Arirang in Goyang. And when fans visit, they don't just come to Korea for the concert, but also to experience the culture. Beyond the music and merch, what we are seeing here is real economic activity. As fans travel, shop, and dine, their spending spreads across the local economy, driving consumption in Korea. From BTS-themed city tours to activities like merch shopping and local dining, these fans transformed their concert trip into a cultural and spending experience.
Once you come here for BTS, you are part of this economical impact because you fly, you buy stuff here, you buy accommodation, so everything you do that is related to them increase economy of Korea.
Hallyu Wave is a big impact for us because as we fans, we really consume and we really buy what our idols are using or endorsing. K-pop in general really attracts tourists to go here in South Korea.
Over the last 10 years, there has been a meaningful increase in the number of foreign visitors to South Korea. From just over 13 million people in 2015, the number in 2025 rose to almost 19 million, up over 43%.
Travel patterns these days are no longer centered on simple sightseeing, but rather on experiencing local culture firsthand and living like a local. For people who are big fans, there are likely to be fewer constraints on spending.
The largest ever by a K-pop act, BTS is visiting 34 cities for a total of 85 shows as part of the group's world tour, which is projected to generate at least $1 billion in direct revenue for the group's agency HYBE and have a multi-billion-dollar impact on the global economy. This is a powerful reminder of the strength of BTSnomics. Park Jun-an, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Choe Hyon, and this is The World Now. Hezbollah's leader on Monday publicly demanded that Lebanon cancel direct talks with Israel. The talks scheduled for Tuesday in Washington would be the first such face-to-face negotiations between the two countries in decades. Naim Qassem made the televised appeal, calling the meeting a free concession to Israel and the United States. Meanwhile, fierce fighting rages in the southern Lebanese town of Bint Jabal, where Israeli forces encircled the area and Hezbollah fighters launched rockets, artillery, and drones. Israel's military said its troops killed more than 100 Hezbollah fighters in the town and surrounding areas. President Donald Trump on Monday refused to apologize to Pope Leo XIV after launching a public attack on the Catholic Church's leader over his opposition to the U.S. war in Iran. Trump criticized the Pope on social media on Sunday, calling him weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. Then posted an AI-generated image depicting himself as a Jesus-like figure laying hands on a sick man. Following a backlash, the image was deleted on Monday, and Trump told reporters it was meant to show him as a doctor, not as Jesus. Pope Leo on Monday said we'll continue speaking out loudly against war. 2 days before tax day in the U.S., President Donald Trump on Monday had 2 bags of McDonald's food delivered to the Oval Office by a DoorDash driver, then handed her a $100 tip on camera to promote his administration's tax cut on tips. Driver Sharon Simmons from Arkansas told Trump the policy had put $11,000 back in her pocket as her husband battled cancer. When a reporter asked if the White House were good tippers, Trump reached into his pocket and handed her the $100 bill. Colombia on Monday ordered the killing of up to 80 hippos. The hippos are the wild descendants of animals drug lord Pablo Escobar illegally imported decades ago. They have spread across the country, threatening villagers and wiping out native species. Colombia's environment minister did not say when the culling would begin. Colombia is the only country outside Africa with a wild hippo population.
Yesterday might have made you wonder if we skipped straight to summer, and today brings more of the same, especially across western parts of Korea. Highs in Seoul will climb to around 27 degrees Celsius again this afternoon, and that is more than a month ahead of what is considered usual. But beware of that classic spring twist, warm days and cooler evenings. Meanwhile, the capital area Chungcheong-namdo and Jeollabuk-do provinces will have dusty air in the morning hours. And central regions will gradually clear this afternoon after a cloudy start, while the southern regions remain mostly overcast. Rain, though, has already begun on Jeju Island and will spread to the southern coast later today. Jeju Island could see up to 30 millimeters of somewhat heavy spring rainfall into Wednesday. And this afternoon, the western regions will warm up quickly into the upper 20s, while the east stays cooler. So Seoul will be getting up to 27 degrees Celsius, but Gyeongju will only get up to 16 degrees this afternoon.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.